Morning folks, welcome to our next lesson in resource management. We're going to kick off straight away today with an image that you can see in front of you. I'd like you to pause this slide and just think for a moment what the headlines might have been that went with this slide. Spend 30 seconds thinking about that. Okay, you might have said something like, well, maybe there's some sort of terror attack and people are running away. Or you might have said that maybe a bomb's gone off somewhere. Or you might have noticed that people have got things over their faces, and you might have said it could be something to do with like a gas explosion or some sort of fight. You might have said maybe there's an earthquake that's happened and people are running away from that, so maybe a natural disaster. There might have been other things that you would have come up with. Here's the actual headlines around this image. Probably something that you wouldn't have thought of. Deaths linked to violent unrest over food insecurity. And this happened in Venezuela just last year. So this is not many months ago. This was October 2019 and people were fighting over food. So that takes us on to today's lesson. Today we're looking at the impacts of food insecurity. So just to remind you, that's not having enough food. There are 5 major impacts of food insecurity, and we're going to be looking at those today. So we've already just touched on one, which is unrest. So if I asked you what the impacts of food insecurity might be, what would you say? Pause this and spend again 30 seconds thinking of all the possible impacts of not having enough food. Okay, you might have said something along the lines of, well, people going hungry, not having enough food. You might even have gone one step further than just being hungry and actually said that people might suffer with starvation and might ultimately die. You might have said social unrest, that we've already talked about. Here's an image of a man carrying a gun, moving his livestock. Now, he's not carrying a gun to shoot livestock or to shoot animals or anything like that. He's carrying that because that's his protection against somebody coming and trying to steal his cattle. That's what people do when there's a food crisis and people are going hungry. They'll do anything they can to get food. Did you think of soil erosion as an impact? Here's a couple of pictures of farms, believe it or not, in countries in northern parts of Africa. You can see the ground is all broken up there, and that soil, when the rains come and when strong winds come, will be washed away. The topsoil will get washed away, which is the best bit. So that's soil erosion. Did you think of that as an impact? Probably not. Did you think of food prices going up and rising? Again, probably not. I mean, you can see from the graph there that when you look at the different foodstuffs, so the bread, the spaghetti, the sugar, we've got 2 years, September 2014 in green, and the yellow is showing March of the following year, and you can see for every single one of those foodstuffs, prices have gone up. That's what happens when there's a shortage. So there we go. We're looking today at those 5 impacts of food insecurity. So, little quick task for you, please. Write down the above title in your book, and when you've done that, move on to the next slide. We're going to start by looking at famine and undernutrition. And there is a YouTube clip that I'd like you to watch. It's actually on the next slide, so it might be that when you click to the next slide, it automatically starts. If it doesn't, you have the link there on the slide, which you can copy and paste into YouTube and watch. This is about famine in Somalia in 2017. So this is only 3 years ago. You would have been in year 7. You probably didn't even know about it. You probably weren't even made aware of it. I'd like you to watch that clip. Then I'd like you to write the subtitle Famine and Undernutrition, because that's the first 2 things we're looking at, and complete those 5 questions that you can see there. You might want to write those out in your book before you start watching the clip, and then you can answer those. Okay, so pretty harrowing clip, I know. Just to clarify then a couple of key terms with you. Famine is a widespread, serious shortage of food, and it leads to 3 types of hunger. That is what famine is, and I would like you, as it says on the task there, to copy that definition into your book. So there are 3 types of hunger, and it's probably quite important that you understand the difference between them, and we have touched on this before. I don't want you to write down these 3 different types, but I want you to be aware of them. So undernutrition is when people do not consume enough calories. I've already said before we need 2,000 a day, and these people will be consuming less than that. Malnutrition is when people do not eat enough of the right foodstuffs to keep them healthy. So their diet is unbalanced. That means that they might be getting enough calories, but it's not balanced. So they're going to be lacking and deficient in certain nutrients. The 3rd type of hunger is wasting, and that is where people are suffering with both undernutrition and malnutrition. Essentially, they're wasting away. That's where the expression comes from. This kind of hunger can go on for a very long time and can ultimately lead to death. The other key term is undernutrition, which we just touched on. This occurs when people do not eat enough nutrients to cover their needs for energy and growth or to maintain a healthy immune system. So it's important, please, that you copy down the key term for famine and undernutrition, and then task B, which out of the 3 types of hunger do you think is the worst? Write that down in your book, justify your answer, and incidentally, all the answers to these questions will be at the end of the slideshow. But I'd rather that you didn't just flick through and copy them down because you won't learn that way. Once you've done these tasks, move on to the next slide. Okay, let's look at soil erosion next. So food insecurity can lead to soil erosion as farmers try to get more out of their land. And that makes sense. If people are short of food, what are they going to do? They're going to try and plant more crops to try and grow more food. They're going to put more cattle on the land to try and rear more cattle and get more meat and more dairy. They might even chop down the trees that are on their land to create more space for the cattle, space for the crops. Unfortunately, these things lead to soil erosion, and I'll explain why. Let's start with the top picture on the right-hand side. Now, I know it's quite small for you to read, but I'll talk you through it. So, if we have got too many animals grazing on one area, that will lead to problems. And this has happened in places like West Africa. So, look at all the cattle there on the grassy bit of that picture. They will be eating the grass, they'll be trampling the ground, and eventually there will be no grass left. And the soil will be left exposed. So where the number 2 is on that image, you can see cattle there on the edge of that grassy area. They're now on the dry area where there's absolutely nothing to eat. So that would be the 2nd stage. And they'll be walking around trying to get whatever they possibly can. But because the soil has now lost all of its vegetation, all of its grass, there are no roots to hold it together. So when the winds pick up and the rains come, it will blow and wash the topsoil away, and the topsoil is the best bit. That's where all the nutrients are. So once that's been lost and washed away, no more grass will be able to grow in the future. So the land essentially turns very desert-like, and we call that desertification. So this process with all the animals on the land is called overgrazing, because they've simply put too many on the land. If they'd halved the amount of cattle, then it might be that not all the grass gets eaten, and therefore more grass can grow back. But because the land has been stripped of all of its grass, and the soil has been exposed and washed away, the grass cannot now grow back. The bottom picture on the right is showing that. You can't see any grass in that image. So ultimately, those cows will either have to move onto more land, so the farmers will have to try and take them somewhere else to find them some food, or they'll die. And that's what we call overgrazing. The top picture on the left is essentially showing you the same thing. However, this is not with animals, this is with crops. So these people are growing the same crop, and they're growing it, they're harvesting it and they're regrowing it and they're harvesting it and they're trying to grow too much of the same thing on the land. And again, they're stripping it of all of its nutrients, because whatever they plant is going to take those nutrients out of the ground in order to grow. And then, of course, they pull the plants up and eat them, and then they plant more, and the same nutrients get taken out of the ground until eventually there are no nutrients left. And as soon as there's no nutrients left, the crops then cannot grow, and the ground becomes useless, like in that bottom right image. And so the people are forced again to move onto other land, otherwise they'll go hungry. The bottom left image is showing you where people have chopped down trees. Now, often they do this to create more space for the cattle and space for the crops, or they might chop them down for fuel wood so that they can cook. However, the problem is very similar to overgrazing and overcultivation. What happens is now the soil is exposed. The soil is exposed to the rain, to the heat from the sun. So again, there's nothing to hold the soil in place, and it gets washed or blown away. Whereas before, the trees would have protected that soil and the roots would have held it all together, so it wouldn't have been able to wash away or blow away, and it wouldn't have been able to dry out in the heat because the trees would have shaded it and protected it. But unfortunately, without the trees, the ground is susceptible to soil erosion. So this is a problem with food insecurity, because people are desperate for food. And when they're desperate, they try to rear more cattle, so that's overgrazing. They try to grow more crops, which is overcultivation. And they clear any trees off the land to create space, which is called deforestation. And those three things lead to soil erosion. And once the soil is useless, it then can't grow crops in the future, so the people will have to move. Eventually, you end up with that. So that land there has been overgrazed, overcultivated, it's had its trees taken away, and it's led to something called desertification, where basically the land has turned to desert. And it's dry from the heat of the sun, it's cracked, and there are no nutrients left there. So that's another problem with. Okay, this image is showing farming in the Sahel area of Africa. We've got two images side by side. These are it's the same land, it's the same family. You can see the man and wife and the children in that image. So they're farming in the Sahel area. The Sahel area of Africa is quite a dry area. It does get rainfall. It's on the edge of the desert, so it's not desert-like, but if they don't look after it properly, it can turn to desert, as just discussed. These farmers are discussing removing the trees on their farms to grow more crops and add more animals so that they can get more meat and more dairy. Your task is to write a short letter to them explaining why that would be a really bad idea and would lead to soil erosion and eventually desertification. So I'd like you to complete that task. You might want to rewind this video slightly to listen again to the previous slide when I explained about overcultivation, overgrazing and deforestation, because the answers are in there. So write a letter to these people explaining why they shouldn't chop the trees down to grow more crops and rear more animal. Once you've done that, move on to the next slide. Okay, the next impact is rising prices. So just to read this through with you, if you have plenty of crops, you will have a big supply of food. That seems obvious. If we've got plenty of supply, so supply is great and it's greater than demand, then the price will fall because there's so much food, there's no competition. That's why potatoes in our country are cheap, because we can grow plenty of potatoes. We've got the perfect climate for them, so we can grow hundreds and thousands of potatoes, which means when you go to the supermarket, they don't cost very much money because we've got great supply. However, when the opposite happens, prices rise. So if we have crops failing, because let's just say there's been a drought, there's not been any rain, and the crops fail, that will lead to a food shortage. So we've got insecurity. Now what happens is demand is higher than supply. We haven't got enough of the food, but everybody wants it. So the price will rise. This results in the poorest people going hungry as they can't afford to buy it. And this is happening all over the world. There are certain foodstuffs that whose prices are increasing year on year. And part of that is because the harvests aren't as good. Each year, the harvest isn't as good. And part of that is to do with climate change. But what it means is the poorest people suffer because they can't afford the rising price. This table here shows you that happening. So for instance, let's look at the photograph first. That's showing you the big pile of rice on the right hand side is what that lady could buy in 2007, and in 2008 the same money bought her a pile of rice that was half the size. So you can see there the effect of rising prices on that lady. She's now not getting as much rice. The table shows you some staple foods. These are foods that are eaten in some of the world's poorest countries. So maize, wheat, rice. These are what we call staple foods. A bit like for us, potatoes are a fairly staple food. But for these people, maize, wheat, rice, soya, and sugar are staple foods. And it says here the rising cost of food, and they're using a base index of 100 in 2004. So if you imagine that there's 100 maize in 2004, by 2007 the price had gone up 104 to 141. So that's 141%. And then by 2008, 179, by 2009, 186, and so on. So you can see the price year on year has pretty much gone up. It's been a slight dip to 2015, but it's still higher than it was in 2007. The same for wheat. Price of wheat soared between 2007 and 2008 quite a lot, and then gradually it's come back down again. Rice, you can see for rice has just gone up a lot, and although it's come back down again slightly, it's still way higher in 2015 than it was in 2007. So these prices have risen, and it's affecting the locals because they're not going to get as much for their money. And that's what happens when you can't grow as much food. Look at these pie charts. The one on the left is showing how poor people in South Africa spend their money, so what their money goes on. The one in the middle is the middle income people, and the one on the right is showing you the rich people. So these are all taken from South Africa. Now you can't see the keys, and really a lot of these colours don't matter. The colour I want you to look at is the light green colour. And what this is showing you is that when you look at the pie chart on the left, these are the poorest people in South Africa. They are spending roughly 30% of their money on food. That's that green colour. That's a lot, 30% of their money spent on food. Look at the middle income people in South Africa. They're spending more like 9% of their money on food. And then look at the wealthy people in South Africa, that's the pie chart on the right, they're spending only 5% of their money on food. So the point, what this really shows you, is that low-income countries and the poorest people in newly emerging economies are hit the hardest by higher food prices because food represents a larger share of their spending. If most of their money is being spent on food already, then if the price of food rises, they simply either get less food for their money or they have to make sacrifices elsewhere, which they struggle to do. Whereas you look at those rich people in South Africa, only a very small percent of their money is spent on food. So if the prices of food rises, it doesn't really affect them very greatly, because they've got plenty of money that they're spending on luxuries, which are the red segments. Okay, what would happen to household spending in Bangladesh if food prices increased by 50%? So Let's have a look at how an average Bangladeshi person spends their money before food prices have risen. This is showing you what they spend on staple grains. Look at the size of that rectangle. Now, staple grains are the common food stuffs that they'll be eating. So like for us, I said potatoes. For them, it's probably rice. So 40% of their spending is going on rice by the looks of things. And then they've got a percentage going on fish and meat, which will have more protein and will be better for them. And they have money going on non-staple plants as well. And then they've got some money that they spend on non-food items like stuff for the home or clothes, etc. But what happens when you increase the food prices by 50%? So now more like 50% of their money is being, in fact, probably slightly more, I'd say 60% of their money is being spent on staple grains, which aren't that nutritious. And look at what they've had to cut back on. They've cut back on fish and meat and the non-staple plants. Unfortunately, those things there, the fish and meat and the non-staple plants, they give them all the extra proteins and fats and carbohydrates that they need in their diet for a balanced diet. So they're cutting back on the things that give you variety and give you balance because they can't afford them, basically. They're too expensive. So instead, they can't have those. They have to spend their money on more staple grains instead. So they're spending more on rice and less on the other things that they need. And of course, they then spend a little bit less on the non-food items because non-food items aren't as essential as food. So the point we're making here is not only do the poorest people suffer the most when prices rise because they can't afford food, but also their diet changes because they can't afford the more expensive food that gives them variety. So what happens is they end up with more malnourishment. So not only might they end up being undernourished and not having enough food, but they're also malnourished because they're not getting the balance and the variety that they need. And that opens them up to all sorts of diseases and infections that they can get because their immune systems are weak. Okay, last couple of tasks for you, please. Task 4, in your own words, I would like you to explain how food insecurity leads to rising prices. Again, you might need to go back on the video slightly to listen to it again. And secondly, the impact that this has on the diets of the poorest, which is what I've just been talking about. When you've done this, move on to the next slide. And this is the last of the major impacts of food insecurity. So put a little title, Social Unrest. And this takes us right back to the beginning of the lesson when we looked at conflict, which is caused by basically being hungry and also caused by rising prices, which people feel very unhappy about. It might be that you want to go back to the very beginning of this video to listen to the narration about social unrest again so that you can answer that question. Task 5, why does food insecurity lead to social unrest? Just write a few sentences on that and then move on to the next slide, which looks at how the coronavirus fits into all of this. Obviously, we're all very aware of the pandemic in our lives at the moment and the sacrifices that we've all made and the fact that it's led to us being locked down in our homes and having to adhere to social distancing measures. But actually, there's a bigger picture to think about, and that is food in the future, going forward this year. So flick onto the next slide and have a look at that. This article here was in the newspaper just a week ago. Headline, instead of coronavirus, the hunger will kill us. A global food crisis looms. The world has never faced a hunger emergency like this, experts say. It could double the number of people facing acute hunger to 265 million by the end of this year, so by the end of 2020. That is a prediction of what's going to happen because of the pandemic. And if you're wondering why, it's because food production will have been impacted. all around the world because people have been in a state of lockdown. Supply routes, certain equipments or foodstuffs, supply routes have been affected. So because of that, people haven't got the things that they need in order to perhaps continue with their own farming. And because of all this disruption that has happened, that will have had an impact on food production moving forward. And so the worry is that it will lead to a global food crisis. Now, in a situation like this, we as wealthy people in a wealthy country don't really need to worry so much because we'll be all right. We've got the money to be able to deal with it, and we can import food in from places that have got it. But the world's poorest, like I said before, will struggle because the chances are prices will rise and they can't afford to pay them. So they're the ones that will end up struggling and will end up with acute hunger. We here in Britain, we will be all right. But it's, a very sad state of affairs, and it's something that we will face. The next slide has a video just a few minutes long which explains about the impact the coronavirus will have. So if you're interested, have a little watch. And that's the end of today's lesson. If the video doesn't automatically load, then you can copy and paste the link above and have a watch on YouTube. Cheerio! Here are the answers to the first two tasks. Please check your answers with mine and add to yours where necessary and make corrections. Then move on to the next slide, which gives you the answers to the last few tasks. Your letter might be different to mine. It doesn't mean that yours is wrong, but you might have mentioned some of the things that I have mentioned in my letter and used the key words, which I've been using as well. If you haven't done that, please try and add keywords into your letter. Again, pause this slide, get what you need from it, and then that's the end of the lesson. Cheerio!